Hello and welcome to Making and Mixing Massive Music Part 3, where in this episode we'll be looking at the bass guitar. I really like bass. If I wasn't a singer by trade, I'll certainly be a bass player. But there can be a lot of difficulty in striking the balance between having too much bass in your track or not enough bass. So in this episode we'll look at some of the techniques that you can use to strike that balance and get your tracks sounding how you want them to. Let's take a look. Okay, so before recording your bass, there's a few items of preparation which I would recommend to give you the best results. Now, many of these may sound obvious, particularly if you're a bass player, but they're not obvious to everybody, so we'll just quickly run through them here. The first thing to do is to take the time to make sure your bass is perfectly in tune. Now, the bass contributes a heck of a lot of energy to your track. And if the tuning is out, then people will hear it and it will destabilise your track. So take the time to get your bass perfectly in tune. Don't accept it's close enough. Try your best to get it precise. Now, this will be further assisted if your bass has been set up correctly. Now, what I'm talking about here is intonation. And intonation makes sure that your bass remains in tune the further up the fretboard you go. Now, I'm not qualified to tell you how to do that or alter the intonation, but it is something worth looking into to make sure your bass is set up correctly. Now, following that, if you can afford to do so, before recording your bass part, try to change the strings on your bass, because there's nothing that sounds better in the world than a bass with new strings. They sound clear, bright, and that will do your track the world of good. So if you can do so, change the strings. Alright, so with our initial preparations done, there is just one more thing that we could do to give our bass part the best chance of being clearly defined. Okay, and we'll just play you a short section. This is how your average bass might sound. Now, what you'll notice is with the bass as it is, all the notes can have a tendency to run into each other due to the natural sustain of the strings. Alright, now there is something we can do to reduce that natural sustain and get a clearer bass part, but it does require a very complex piece of equipment. The good news is you may already own this. Let's take a look. It's called a sock. Okay, so let me just push this down by the strings for a moment and see if we can take this natural sustain down just a little bit. Now, of course, you can adjust the position of your sock to get the result that you want, but it will be something like this. And now without the sock. Okay, so you can hear there that dampening the strings slightly can make each and every note more clearly defined, and that might be what you need if you're recording a particularly complex bass part. It might not be a technique that's useful to you. Your bass player probably will hate the idea, but it might suit the music that you're recording. So have a think about it. If it works for you, then great. It's just something I wanted to offer up there. So now you have your bass guitar set up, you're about ready to start recording. Now this seems as good as any a place to bring in the concept of a preamp. And here's mine. Now a preamp is a device that sits in between either the instrument and your recording device, or the microphone and your recording device. It's something that receives the signal from either the instrument or the microphone and treats it before it hits your recording device. Okay, so again, here's mine. Now again, I'm not qualified to tell you exactly how a preamp works, but I can tell you that the results that you get. A preamp stabilises and warms up and generally improves the signal from the instrument or the microphone before it hits the recorder. For example, this device that I have, you can set it to add just a fraction of compression or just a fraction of saturation, and the results, not to be too simplistic about it, they just sound better. And it's not something that I've ever been able to replicate once the signal has been recorded, so a preamp is well worth investing in. They don't have to cost the earth, and if you don't already own one, then I could suggest just hiring one, borrowing one, and I assure you, once you've heard the results that these can deliver, you'll never turn back again. It's just something that gives you that extra professional sound. Alright, so this will go in between either the guitar or the microphone before we get to the recorder. So now we're about ready to start recording our bass guitar. Now the next decision to be made is, do you want to record direct from the bass into recorder, or do you want to amplify your bass and mic up the bass guitar amplifier? Now it's worth saying at this point that many professional recordings, they actually use both of those things, the direct output and the microphone output, and mix them together. But let's just look at each individually and see how you would treat them. First of all, if you were choosing to mic up the bass guitar amp, you might you will need a microphone a bit like this. So this is the same type of microphone we met in the second of this video series. It's a microphone that's very wide and is designed to pick up low bass frequencies. Okay, now you might notice this is the exact same microphone from the second video. So I would say at this point that I don't suggest that you use the same mic for the bass cabinet as for the kick drum, because the mic will hear both those things in the same way and leave its own imprint on both of those tracks, which will make it harder to separate them out in the mix a bit further down the line. But assuming that you do have an equivalent bassy microphone, let's just look at how you would mic up the bass cabinet. So we have our bass guitar amplifier, which of course this is not a bass guitar amplifier, but just for this video. Now the next thing to know is to close mic the bass cabinet. So we're going to put the microphone just an inch or at most 2 inches away from the grill. The reason we do that is we don't want to pick up too much room ambience, because the bass line needs to be as clear as possible, and room ambience will make it sound further away. So the mic's nice and close to the grill. Now mic position is also very important. If you aim your mic straight into the centre of the speaker cone, you'll pick up all the brightness and the top end that the cabinet is pushing out, and that will leave you with a very bright recorded bass part. If you choose to move the microphone to the edge of the speaker cone, the further that you go, the less clicky and the less high end the recording will be, and the warmer it will sound. So it's worth experimenting and see what sound that you want to record. But there's something we can do here that's might be a good idea, and that's record the bass direct into your recorder and then play back the part through the amplifier, where you can then experiment with mic position and EQ settings. You could put it in different rooms, use different mics to your heart's content, knowing that the part is already recorded. And that's called reamping. Okay, so record your bass direct, then play it back and change the settings, change your preamp, change the microphone, change the position to get the sound that you want. Alright? Now with all those things in place, let's see what we're going to do to the bass part when it's in our recorder. Let's take a look now. Alright, so now we've recorded our bass and we've imported the tracks into our studio software, the ones in pink here. Now what you'll also notice is we've recorded several takes of the same song, so we've got 3 versions of the bass part in this example. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take these multiple takes and edit them to create the ultimate bass guitar part. Now this process is called comping. Okay, and it can be applied to any instrument that you record, from drums through bass, guitars, vocals, anything at all. The idea, as I've said, is record the part many times over and then extract the best bits from each take. Okay, so what I'm first going to do, create an empty track here. And now what we're going to do is listen to each part in turn, a few bars at a time, and take the best bits. Okay, so here we go. So we've got our bass guitar playing with the drums, of course, there. And we're listening for the best performance we can find. So let's go back and see how take 2 compares. And then of course let's see how take 3 fares in the same section. Now the point is you'll soon build up a picture of the best elements of each performance, and the idea is to chop these parts to get the best bits into one single take. So just to skip along at a bit of a pace, you'll end up with something like this. And this will go on to be the ultimate bass take here, okay? Now once you've layered all the sections against each other, just like we did in the drum tutorial, which was part 2 of this series, we're going to create ever so small crossfades. Oops. Just to make sure that there's no clicks and pops emerging to make our take sound not very good. Okay, now with all that done, what you'll be left with is the ultimate bass take, which might look something like this. So what I've done here is I've extracted all the best bits from each bass take, put them all together on the same channel, inserted crossfades, and then exported the whole track and re-imported it as a WAV in its own right. Okay, so now we've got the ultimate bit of bass. Here we go. Okay, and that, as I say, is called comping. So now we're just going to take a quick look at editing the bass and correcting the timing to make it sound even tighter still. Let's take a look. Now, as I said earlier in this tutorial, the bass contributes a heck of a lot of energy to your track. And for that reason, it's vitally important that it's precisely in time. If it wasn't to be in time and it was drifting all over the place, then it would destabilize your whole song. Okay, so we're just going to hear a short piece of music now just to illustrate this point, where there are some stabs in this section that we need to make sure the bass is hitting at the same time as the kick drum to make it sound nice and tight. Let's take a listen. Okay, so we have these stab sections in this piece, and I say it's crucial that the bass does hit at the same time as the kick. So we've got our kick here, and we have our comped bass part down here. So we're just going to raise that up and put it next to the kick drum. We're now going to grow the part so we can see what's going on a bit easier. And we'll just solo the kick and the bass together. So here's just a short couple of seconds where the kick drum's stabbing. There's the kick, kick and kick, and the bass needs to be at exactly the same time. Okay, now you can see here, even before going any further, the bass is a little too soon, and there's the kick there. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to cut up the bass guitar track and drag it back into time. Now, just as we did in the second of this video series with the drums, we're going to snip just before each peak in the WAV file, okay? And that's because when we glue these tracks back together in a few moments, any crossovers will be less noticeable, okay? So we just snipped up our 3 bass notes there. Let's just have a listen to them before we do anything more. And what we're going to do is we're going to drag them so they match the bar line where the kick is. So here's our first one. There's the first peak in the WAV. So we want to line it up just so the start of the WAV falls on the bar line in the same way the kick does. There's our kick there. Let's just move along a bit. As you can see, this bass hit is quite soon. Too early is what I mean by that. So we're going to drag it back into time. So the start of the WAV, not the peak of the WAV, but the start of the WAV falls on the bar line. And our last one here, well, let's just take that out of the way. As you can see, this bass note is also too early because our bar line's here. So we're going to drag that back again where it's supposed to be. Now again, just as we did in our drum tutorial, we're going to create some crossfades. So we're going to overlap those at a suitable distance. Oops, we don't want to go that far. Just going to overlap these parts here. Just as we did in tutorial number 2, same applies. Just going to overlap there. Oops, just need to bring that back a bit. So what we have, we put our crossfades in now, crossfade, crossfade, crossfade. What this section will have now is the bass hitting at the same time as those kicks. Just take a listen. Nice and tight. Let's just hear that again because it's quite exciting. So if we just go back to our original track and hear that in context. With the bass edited to be exactly with the drums, it does add to the power of the track. And as I've said before, if that wasn't the case and we'd left the bass slightly out of time with the kick, it would create a bit of a shaky foundation for the track to sit on. Now, of course, the important thing is you can take this technique and make sure the starts of your song fall exactly in time. You can make sure the ends are exactly in time. Anywhere where it is very, very important and clear to the listener that the bass needs to be exactly in time, then use this editing technique to line up your bass, particularly with the kick or whichever drum is playing at the time. Now, before looking at adding EQ and effects to your bass channel, I just want to take another quick look at a concept we introduced in video number 1 of this series, and that's the power of 3. Because where the bass guitar is concerned, if you imagine that the listener can only listen to 3 key instruments at any given time, it may be that the bass is often not one of your 3. Okay? So in many cases, the bass will simply be there to support the guitars and the vocals and the drums, for example. But once in a while, the bass does come to the front of the mix because other instruments may drop out, for example, or it might be doing a fill of its own, that kind of thing. So the point I'm trying to make is you need to snip up the bass part and treat the bits that you want the listener to hear clearly, differently to the parts of the bass where it's only there to support the other instruments. So let's have a look at a project where that has been applied. So here we are in our project, and I've been through the song arrangement and identified that the bass in this section here, all the way through this part of the song, is only there to support the guitars. For example, that will sound like this. Now, I haven't put the vocals in just to give a bit of extra clarity in this tutorial, but the point is the bass there is simply giving a foundation under all those guitars and what would be the vocals on top as well. But earlier in the song, the bass is actually one of the 3 instruments that I need you to hear. So I've actually snipped that section out and put it on a track of its own, and we're going to treat it differently. So here's the bass as one of the big 3. And as we'll hear shortly, we're going to treat those 2 parts differently to make the bass, where it is one of the 3 instruments that you need to hear, sound that more brighter and clearer and up front when compared to the bass that's simply there to support the other instruments. So just in summary, it's worth going through your song and just identifying the areas where you want the bass to be at the front of the mix and the areas where it is simply there as support to the other instruments, and put those things on different tracks. Okay, so with that done, we're ready to take a look at some EQ and effects. Here we go. Okay, so ready to do a bit of processing of the bass tracks we've got now, okay? Now, although in this tutorial I will be doing a lot of solo mode work on the bass tracks, the changes I'm going to make when you do them for real, I strongly recommend you don't spend too long with the solo button pressed, because the important thing isn't how great the bass sounds in solo mode, but it's how it works when blended in with the other instruments, okay? So please don't think that just because I use solo mode a lot, that's how to do it. It's purely for illustration purposes. Having said that though, what I've got here, we've got the bass where it's not one of our big 3, our important 3 instruments. We've got the bits of the bass track which need to be at the front of the mix because they are one of our important 3 instruments. Now I've set up a group track here. This group track, I've sent both the less important bass and the very important bass, if you like, into this bass group. But I've also set up 2 parallel effects. I've got a compressor here. In fact, I've got lots and lots of compressors. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And I've also got a little bit of stereo chorus. Again, we'll come back to that in just a moment. So what I've done, as I've got my bass parts and 2 parallel effects and sent each of these channels to a final group channel so I can control the bass with just 1 fader here. Okay? So let's take a bit of a look at the bass when it is only a supporting instrument. It's not there at the front of the mix. Let's just throw the drums in and have a quick listen to what we've got. And here's the guitars. Okay. Now the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in a filter, because again, as we looked at in the second tutorial, we don't want anything below about 40 Hertz because it's a useless low frequency that will just take up your headroom and doesn't contribute very much to the mix at all. So I've added a filter in first and foremost. Now next thing, the bass needs to be an absolutely solid foundation. It can't be flapping around in the mix at all. So I'm going to add in a compressor. All right, so we've got a compressor in now as well. So already, the compressor is adding a bit of rigidity to the bass part there. Making it more of a consistent volume, which is very important, as I say, because the bass is the foundation that your track will stand on. But then we're going to do a bit of EQing, okay? Now, when you do this for real, as I've said, do this not in solo mode. Now, you recall back from tutorial number 2 that we boosted the kick drum at around about 60 Hertz. We're going to boost our bass somewhere different, so I've gone for about 80. Okay, that's to try and make it that bit more distinct from the kick drum. Now also, the bass, like any other instrument, has frequencies that are of no use. Now, in this example, it's around about, what is it, just over 200. If you hear that oohing, woolly sound there, that's not really adding to our track at all, so we're just going to take that out a little bit. Again, you'd measure that against the guitars in reality. Now the next change may be a little controversial and your bass player probably won't like you doing it. But if you imagine the bass playing with all the guitars, let's just throw them in now. Where are you? The guitars are adding a lot of high end, which is around about here, about 2K upwards. So they're occupying all this territory up here, okay? So really, we need to keep the bass out of their way, otherwise it'll get tangled up with the guitars. So I'm going to take a cut at the high end of the bass there in the interests of making the bass sound separate from the guitars. And the result sounds like this. It's just a way of, say, keeping the instruments distinct from each other. Now, just to justify that further, if you listen to me boosting that end, really all you have at that far high up on a bass guitar is things like scratching on the strings, fret noise, that kind of thing, because the bass is designed to occupy this low end of the mix. So there's nothing useful to be had up here. So again, taking that out, I would suggest, is the way to go to make it stand apart from the guitars. Now with that done, we're going to add in some parallel compression now to further solidify the bass. Okay, so here we go. Now when adding parallel compression, I've got a number of compressors all working in series here. Okay, so I've got one where the preset is in fact called bass pin down, and I've really driven this compressor because I want the bass to have very little dynamic movement, so it does give you a solid foundation. So I've cranked that compressor right up high there. But then I've added another one in straight after and driven that pretty hard as well. As I say, we've got 8 or so decibels of gain reduction there. But then, not content with that, I've also added in a limiter to really lower the ceiling on this bass part. So the point I'm trying to make is we don't want the bass moving around very much at all. Okay? So when it's coupled with the drums, you have a very solid foundation for the rest of your track to stand on top of. Now you also remember that I do have some stereo chorus here. If we just hook that up with the bass, we just get that online as well. Now that's how it sounds on its own. You don't want very much of this. Now the idea behind this effect is just to spread the bass out to the sides just a little bit. But you don't want to go mad, because if the bass sounds like it's coming away from the centre of the mix, again, that will destabilise your whole song. But just to spread the bass out a bit of stereo chorus is quite a useful effect, but just use it sparingly. And there's our bass overall. Now you can probably tell that already your ears are being drawn to the drums and the guitars, and when the vocals come in a bit later, you'll be listening to those as well. The bass is simply there just to support in this section of the song. Now there are times in the song where the bass does need to be one of the main 3 instruments that the listeners are paying attention to. So how are we going to make the bass stand out against the other instruments to make sure that it's one of the focal points of the track? Well, of course, we can do that by volume, but there is also other things we can do to really clarify the bass part to the listener. All right. Now, the first thing, we've got the track here. We have sent it to our parallel compression and our stereo chorus, just as before. So those effects still apply this time round. And in addition, we are going to apply the filter, because that's good practice to take away that less than 40 Hertz dross at the end of your track. But an interesting effect to bring bass out to the front of the mix is distortion. Okay, so let's just play this bass without it. So it sounds much the same as our earlier bass, but we're going to hit the distortion now. So as you can hear, the bass does sound a lot brighter now, and can really cut it against the drums and what will be the vocals on top as well. So it's right up front, clearly as one of the instruments that you need to be paying attention to. So let's just hear that in context with the other instruments. That distortion there, just adding a bit of bite, a bit of click to the bass to make it really stand out. Incidentally, I'm just using an old plugin called Quadrafuzz, but any distortion is worth experimenting with, just to give that extra click. But then when the guitars come in, it ducks back down and is less bright now to make room for that wall of guitars. But you'll still notice that the parallel compressor there, just there, is holding the bass absolutely steadfast. It's not going anywhere, so we've got a really strong foundation for our track to sit on. Okay, but how do we know that we have enough bass and not too much bass in our mix? Well, let's just take a look what we can do to assess that now. Now, when gauging how much bass you need in your track, this is where using reference music is especially important. Now, you can, of course, just use your ears and listen to what's coming out of your monitors, but when it comes to bass, it isn't always easy on home recording equipment to detect just how much bass is too much, how much is too little, how much you should have, etc. Because you do need some pretty high-end gear to really make that distinction accurately. But there's another way, so let's take a look at that now. Now, if you come back to what we discussed in earlier videos, you will have some reference music that will give you an idea of how you want your track to sound. Now, I've thrown in this track up here, a song that we're going to use as our reference music. Now, to avoid copyright entanglements, I've used one of my own songs just to illustrate the point. But of course, you'll insert maybe a professional track that you like the sound of, that you're going to measure your own recordings against. So here's our reference music playing on its own. And here's our track we're going to measure against it. So how do I know, apart from using my ears, that I've got enough bass in my new recording as compared to the reference music? And the answer is we're going to look at our meters. So if we go across to our stereo out here, what you can do is open up an EQ analyzer. Okay, now often these are bundled with your home studio recording program, but if not, then these can be acquired. And it's looking at the EQ content of your recording. So if you look at the professional track, you can see the bass round here is behaving in a certain way. And that's what we want to do something like with our new recording. So this EQ curve here, we want something similar from our own track. And have we? Let's take the reference music off. And we've got something similar. So it's fair to conclude that when compared to our reference music, our meters are showing us that we have a comparable level of bass when compared to the other frequencies in the track. And of course, you can verify this again by using your ears. Again, using multiple types of playback equipment is a good idea. Don't just use your studio monitors. Use headphones, use an old CD player in your kitchen, that kind of thing. Use your car stereo. Use as many different types of playback equipment as you can, just to build a picture. How does your track sound when compared to the professionals? But as I say, in addition to that, using your meters when mixing bass is invaluable. All right. So that's it for episode 3 on bass guitar. Next time we shall look at the actual guitars. I hope you've found this useful. Thank you very much. See you again.